today is exploring features of speech and language among multilingual children during academic instruction. A little bit about my background. So I'm an associate professor in ESOL bilingualism in the School of Teaching and Learning. And the broad aim of my research program is to gain a better understanding of differences in language experience and then how this impacts language acquisition. So the goals of my research are to generate predictive theories of language acquisition that are going to incorporate individual differences and environmental differences. And then informed by those theories, develop technology-enhanced tools for enabling language research and language teaching and learning. And so for my talk today, I will first introduce the Bilingual Instruction Strategy Project, or the BIS project. This is a remote delivery dual language academic vocabulary intervention. This is an ongoing multi-year study that has produced a really rich language data set of recorded one-on-one lessons with multilingual children. So in the second half of the talk, I'll describe the various approaches that we're taking now to explore these data, including examining language features with CLAN and chat, exploring speech disfluencies with FluCalc, and looking at inferential language with SABRE coding. And then finally, I'll outline our future plans for using natural language processing to examine the phenomenon of linguistic synchrony, which up till now has really been only minimally explored among multilinguals and children. So that's what I'll be talking about today, and I'll be talking fast so I can get it in under the time. So as I mentioned, BIS is an ongoing study that tests the effects of using Spanish language supports in the context of English explicit academic vocabulary instruction among fourth grade Spanish-speaking English learners. So this is a Goal 1 study funded by IES, and we're using random assignment to place students into one of two instructional conditions. So in our single language condition, we consistently use English for instruction. And then in our mixed language condition, we use Spanish language supports extremely strategically throughout the instruction. So we're not ready to present the final results related to the differences in the two instructional conditions, but I will share with you sort of the background information about this study and then the projects that have grown out of the large amount of data that we've been fortunate to collect with this study. So as sort of background for this study, a 2014 systematic review of research on K-12 English learner vocabulary interventions identified 20 peer-reviewed studies that met our What Works Clearinghouse criteria for rigor. And they found that these all tested a wide range of vocabulary instruction strategies. And this emphasis on multi-strategy interventions has meant that the information about the effectiveness of any single particular strategy is really limited. And the particular strategy that I'm really interested in and that we're interested in this study is providing first language definitions. And there's considerable theoretical and empirical work that really suggests that a first language definition should assist an English learner in forming a richer semantic representation of a new lexical item than we would achieve with just an English definition. But a lot of this research that has been done on the effects of L1 vocabulary supports in L2 learning contexts has been done in foreign language education settings, which they're just characteristically very different, right, from an English learner's K-12 context. And so we're still not quite sure what this would look like if we had a target language that was the dominant societal language, if learners didn't share a common first language. It's just a very different context. Additionally, sort of paradoxically, we see resistance from learners and teachers in foreign language classrooms to exclusive use of the L2. And then in a US K-12 context, we kind of see the opposite. We see resistance from teachers to use the L1 in the classroom. So we're sort of in this interesting situation where it'd be really helpful for us as researchers to be able to identify the functional purposes that are served by using the first language along with the second language, and in particular, the effectiveness. So that's really what we're sort of interested in figuring out. And it's worthwhile for us to identify what are going to be the most effective strategies for teaching English academic vocabulary for K-12, because we have a learner need. About 10% of students in the US are English learners. And unfortunately, they're also the group that is much more likely to be taught by a teacher without a qualification specifically for English learners. So we really want to increase robust evidence-based curricula that is going to support creating rich language environments. We know that this is what is really beneficial for English learners. And additionally, sort of weaving in that technology strand, we also have a lot of barriers to implementation when it comes to the academic vocabulary interventions that we have developed. We see barriers around intervention fidelity, in particular related to time or teacher resources. And we also have barriers related to creating dual language interventions that we then ask the majority English only speaking teacher population to deliver. So we have a really pressing need to be innovative and figure out, okay, what would be the most robust evidence-based instruction that we could deliver, and how can we deliver it? How can we make it accessible to as many learners as possible? And so that's really, the background for why the BIS study exists and why it's important for us to figure out, what is the most effective method here. So with the BIS study, what we hope to learn is if the strategic use of first language supports will improve L2 vocabulary learning, and as a sort of secondary consideration, which factors moderate the effect of bilingual versus monolingual methods of instruction. And while not one of our explicit RQs, we're also examining the viability of this type of remote delivery instruction. One of the really unique affordances of RDI, of remote delivery instruction, is it lets us kind of bring bilingual instructors into schools that otherwise may not have access to bilingual practitioners. So even for this study, we were able to recruit highly qualified instructors who were open to work remotely, some of whom were former teachers who had left the profession. And so we really see RDI as a wonderful potential direction for supporting under-resourced districts, geographic regions that maybe struggle to attract and retain bilingual practitioners, and also a way of supporting learners who come from less commonly spoken language backgrounds where it may be hard to have bilingual practitioners available in school contexts. So this randomized control trial has 4 cohorts total. In this study, we have learners nested within schools. And our Spanish-speaking English learners receive 6 weeks of one-on-one remote instruction after school. And the instruction targets English academic vocabulary. So they have twice a week, 30-minute sessions. Our instructors are trained on the curriculum and on best practices for academic vocabulary instruction. And then they deliver the intervention over Teams. So students are assessed one-on-one in Spanish and English before and after. We assess Spanish vocabulary, Spanish reading comprehension, English vocabulary, English reading comprehension. And then we also look at executive function skills. And then we have the measures that specifically focus on gains on the academic vocabulary that are targeted by the curriculum. What do we predict? We predict a benefit of L1 definitions. We predict that executive function skills will moderate the effects of the bilingual strategy based on some of our prior work. But of course, it is possible that there's no benefit of L1 definitions. Perhaps our findings would lend support to a completely different model. We've thought about this, and perhaps the instructors switching between languages and switching into the L1 for those definitions actually constitutes a cognitive burden for the learner. So we're really excited to see where this goes. The grant was approved summer 2020, and the first thing we worked on was the RDI methodology. We had created intervention materials for face-to-face instruction before, but this was a new modality for us. So we had to design an after-school program that could be delivered remotely, which sounds really simple, but it actually is pretty complex. So we have a school liaison in each school who collects the learners during their after-school time and sets them up in front of the computers, which we had delivered to the schools. We had to make sure the liaisons had their technology training. So it's a paraprofessional who's already there in the school for after school. We then had to train our own instructors. We had to figure out how to use Teams for instruction delivery, set up all our assessments in Inquisit. We then piloted, before our pilot, we went through with one participant. We recruited one participant to screen all materials and assessments and go through everything. Then we made, iterative design changes. Then we started our pilot. Our pilot took place spring 2021. We had 6 participants in the pilot. We went through all of that, and then made further improvements, and then started our full cohort in spring 2022. In spring 2022. And then our second cohort started fall 2023, and we are now in our third cohort in fall 2024. So a quick overview of what this instruction looks like, and I won't go super in depth on our curricular content unless there's a lot of interest, and then we can talk about it at the end. But this is a 6-week intervention that uses explicit vocabulary instruction strategies and shared reading of informational texts to support acquisition of English academic vocabulary and development of inferential language. So curriculum has 6 units on the Florida Everglades. We developed this in collaboration with our partner districts to make sure that we are following those Florida state standards for 4th grade and matching what the schools felt was important, and particularly focusing on Tier 2 vocabulary. Students meet with their instructor one-on-one over Teams twice a week for 30 minutes. And in both the single language and mixed language condition, they get that 5-step scripted lesson following best practices. So pre-teaching the 5 words, establishing a purpose for reading, then they have a shared reading passage together. And the learners have physical materials that support their learning while they're receiving that RDI instruction. Then they have a discussion with the instructor in which the instructors use upward and downward scaffolding techniques. Upward scaffolding, making things more cognitively and linguistically demanding if the learner can, go up with them, and downward scaffolding, so decreasing the linguistic and cognitive demands if needed. And we train our instructors to do that upward or downward scaffolding. And then they also use the Strive for 5 strategies. So their goal is to get 5 serve and returns with the child to really support language production. And then at the end, they review the 5 target words. So here's a little example of what the cards would look like, the physical cards that the learners get. In the mixed language condition, you can see they have the spelling, an image that represents it, a child-friendly definition, which is orally presented, and then an extension activity and opportunities to have this back and forth conversation with the provisions for upward and downward scaffolding. And I'll circle back to this back and forth conversation when I talk about our analysis of the inferential language that's occurring in the curriculum. And here's an example just quickly of the digital copy of the card, and they get a physical paper copy as well that the child uses. So on the left is what the child has, and then on the right is the scripted teacher lesson card. And we followed What Works Clearinghouse best practices for language and literacy instruction for English learners. So the curriculum is scripted, and we're aware, and we can talk more about sort of the pluses and minuses of scripted curricula. But in addition, we created these opportunities for unscripted conversations. So each lesson contains 6 episodes for unscripted conversation, which is initiated by a scripted question. And then again, the instructors go into upward, downward scaffolding and Strive for 5 to keep those conversations going. So I'll return to those unscripted portions when we talk about the inferential language in the lesson. But here's sort of an example, right? The instructor would say, let's talk about what we wanted to find out. What did we learn about how an invasive species came to live in the Everglades, right? And then they would have a back and forth conversation with the student to elicit inferential language from them, tied to what was the purpose of reading and what did they learn. And ideally, get a minimum of those 5 conversational turns and support that with upward or downward scaffolding. So because this was a new modality for us, we really needed to test it out. We needed to explore usability and feasibility, including methods and materials. And we also really needed to see with the pilot, does this at a minimum improve learning over baseline? So the pilot was really important to us. Another reason the pilot was important to us was for fidelity of implementation, because we really wanted to see, does remote synchronous modality, how does that compare to the prior existing research on delivering these types of interventions face-to-face? Because fidelity is such an area of challenge for scripted language interventions for elementary. Zucker and colleagues published a really interesting paper addressing this recently and sort of talking about the tension about how, as researchers, we create these scripted interventions and then we give them to elementary teachers who may struggle to deliver them with fidelity in a school context due to many, many reasons. And Zucker and colleagues in their research found that fidelity sometimes dropped even below 50%. So our sort of thought with this is, does RDI allow us to deliver scripted interventions with higher fidelity? And so with the pilot, we had, as I said, 6 participants who are LYB. So that's going to be like lower intermediate, or what state of Florida would call limited English proficiency. And we really wanted to compare the fidelity to prior interventions. So we transcribed and coded 33 videos of their lessons, and we used a fidelity implementation checklist. And we were really delighted with our result, with what we found. We found extremely high fidelity. For a lot of our components, we found 90 to 100% fidelity, which is extraordinarily high for an elementary intervention of this nature. We did think it would be higher because of the affordances of RDI, but this was sort of beyond what we were even predicting. And then we also found 22% gains in instructed vocabulary over baseline for both conditions. So this was really positive for us, and really leads us to posit that there's potential for remote delivery instruction, and in particular for remote delivery instruction to allow us to have bilingual instruction that can exist within a broader mainstream monolingual educational context. So the schools where we're recruiting, the schools where we're delivering this intervention are not dual language schools. These are not schools with bilingual programs. These are schools where we're able to almost bring a bilingual instructor into the school. And so we have a lot of hope that this modality and this approach has the potential to, in particular, benefit children from less commonly spoken language backgrounds and benefit children in districts without bilingual personnel. So we're excited about this. We're now in data collection for the third cohort, and we look forward to presenting results related to the differences between the two instructional conditions, but at the conclusion of the study. But as I'm sure you can imagine, as you're sort of thinking about us delivering all these remote delivery lessons, is that in addition to this, the BIS study has produced this really rich data set with samples of fourth grade emerging bilingual speech over the course of 6 weeks of instruction. And this is a population that is generally under-researched, particularly our learners who are LYA and LYP. So again, what state of Florida would call limited English proficiency. So we have a lot of data here. We video record as many as 3 of the 30-minute lessons from each child for our fidelity coding, and then transcribe them. So right now we have over 380 session raw transcripts. And this is just for us a really exciting, rich repository that offers opportunities to explore many other questions. So we're currently moving through these video recordings of the sessions, transcribing them, coding them, and thinking of ways to analyze these data to learn more about the language that children produce, the fluency and disfluency patterns, how they respond to different instructional elements. We have had and currently have a lot of doc students who are working on exploring their own research questions in this area. So we're really excited. And in the second half of this talk, I'll share some of these various approaches with you that we're using to explore this data set. And at the end, if you have any ideas as well, we're super receptive to any sort of creative thoughts about this. So the 3 approaches that we're using at the moment, we use CHAT, which is a transcription format designed for analysis by CLAN, which is a child language analysis network program. And I'll talk a bit about that. It looks at features of language production. We're also using FluCalc, which is a sub-program of CLAN, and that focuses on disfluencies, which refers to just disruptions in that forward flow of speech. And then we're also using SABRE, which is Systematic Assessment of Book Reading. And this is a coding system that examines features of child and teacher talk during shared reading experiences, and in particular allows us to code for inferential language. So for anyone who's not super familiar with CLAN, CLAN is designed specifically to analyze data transcribed in chat format. So this is all part of the larger child language data exchange system, or CHILDIS, which focuses on language acquisition. So once you've transcribed something into chat, you can then run CLAN, which is a wonderful program. And within CLAN, we use KittyVal. And what KittyVal does for us is it automatically calculates metrics like total utterances, mean length of utterance, which is a very nice proxy for syntactic complexity. You can look at mean length of utterance in words or morphemes. You can look at morphemes. You can look at errors in syntax. You can look at vocabulary diversity. It'll also generate a developmental sentence score or generate language profiles. Those are just a few examples. It has tons and tons. It does type token ratio, tons of different things that CLAN is outstanding, and will, once you've coded it properly, it will kind of blurb and give it to you at the end in very usable format. So here's an example of what sort of a chat transcription looks like. And so for our preliminary analysis, we used a data set that consisted of 16 transcripts collected from 8 child participants and their instructors. So we had 3 female and 5 male students, and we just wanted to sort of get started looking at what does this look like. We wanted to analyze the participants' academic language, and so we wanted to look at those 6 key sections that occur in every lesson of unscripted conversation that elicit that back and forth discussion from the instructor and child, right? For obvious reasons, we didn't want a part where the instructor says, say this word with me, predict, and then the child says, predict, right? That's not going to give us that, we don't want to calculate mean length of utterance for that. We wanted to know more about what the productive language environment was like for the child. And truly what we were sort of interested in getting started exploring is there evidence that the child is in a rich, productive language environment? Are they having opportunities to produce language? And so here's what we found, at least in that initial analysis, for total utterances. That's the sum of all spoken statements within the given data set. So within those open conversation portions. And you can see we have some variation, but during those 6 key sections of the lesson that elicit that back and forth conversation between the instructor and the child, you can see our average was a little bit over 65 utterances. So that's nice. That's a lot of talk for mean length of utterance. And again, this is a metric used to assess language development. So higher MLU would indicate more advanced language use, right? So an MLU of 3, you can almost think of that as like an utterance or a sentence that's just maybe subject, verb, right? Just 3. But for ours, we saw that we had an average of 5.7 in length. So that was really nice for me sort of looking at it, because that indicates to me that students are generating multi-word sentences that are being elicited by the scripted curriculum. And then for VOC-D, that's vocabulary diversity. That's a measure that assesses the diversity of the vocabulary in a single transcript. We found an average vocabulary diversity of a little bit over 50. Although it's important to approach that one in particular with caution, because to get it really reliable, you want at least 50 utterances to run a reliable VOC-D analysis. And for a few of our participants, we weren't quite up there. But these were still really nice preliminary findings. We take this as sort of preliminary evidence that this instruction is eliciting rich language from students in a one-on-one scripted remote delivery context. We don't actually have a lot of baseline like norms to compare this against, which leads us to sort of our next steps, right? Which is we want to continue coding this, we want to continue working on this. This is a sizable coding task, right? But once we move through it, we want to be able to address research questions with this data set, because what we have is a very large data set of LYB and LYA, so emerging bilingual speech, over the course of 6 weeks. And interestingly, the field lacks reliable normative estimates for characterizing language development trajectories for diverse samples, such as this sample. So what we'd really like to do is be able to characterize the speech of emergent bilingual Spanish, English, 4th graders. Ideally, we'd love to do this with all 200 participants and be able to really make a contribution to the field to give some baselines that other things could then be compared against. We'd also like to examine changes over time. That's particularly interesting to us, as well as differences in condition. And then see if we can maybe make some associations with that growth data from other measures, or look at relationships with individual characteristics, right? We have those assessments for Spanish reading and vocabulary, English reading and vocabulary, and EF. So all of this would be a really interesting area to keep exploring for us. We're also excited about examining speech disfluencies. This is something that I'm super excited about. And I hope by the end of this, you'll be excited about speech disfluencies too. I think they get overlooked. So speech disfluencies refer to interruptions in the forward flow of speech. This is distinct from more like common use of fluency to characterize knowledge of a language, right? Where someone say like, oh, I'm fluent in Spanish. Disfluencies in this context really refer to that forward flow of speech. And a disfluency is something like repeating a word or phrase, an interjection like mazes, where you sort of go back and repeat a section, fragments, all of the things that I do more of when I talk about disfluencies, I then produce more disfluencies, right? And they're very, very typical. So FluCalc, which is a sub-program of CLAN, will provide quantity and frequency of various speech disfluencies. And so we're really interested in looking at the speech disfluencies that are produced by these fourth grade Spanish-speaking English language learners during both conditions and comparing the outcomes. And just as sort of frame of reference, if you're kind of wondering what does it look like and how much work is it to code for disfluencies, this is an example of what a transcription coded for disfluencies looks like. So it's a secondary lift once you've already coded in chat for other stuff, to then code for disfluencies is an additional lift and requires a lot of additional training. So why would we even bother? Well, disfluencies are very interesting. This is a highly, highly underexplored area that really does shed light on the underlying mechanisms of speech production and second language acquisition. As I mentioned before, typical everyday speech is full of disfluencies, interjections, revisions, pauses, repetitions. And from a speech production perspective, these disfluencies reflect speech processing errors or demands. It can reflect speakers' confidence or fatigue. I get that myself, right? The longer I talk, the more disfluencies. It can also reflect a lot of processes that are mediated by executive function. And the research generally, especially the research among monolinguals, indicates a very strong relationship between disfluencies and executive function. And this is overall extremely underexplored, in particular among bilinguals. Bilinguals in general, the research indicates, produce higher rates of disfluencies in English than English monolinguals. And previously, this finding had always been attributed to an intrinsic demand of managing multiple languages, right? So just being bilingual or multilingual, having to manage those multiple languages, that increases your speech processing demands. And that's why we see, at least, in the literature looking at English, more disfluencies being produced by people who speak English and another language. That was sort of what everyone assumed for a while. But my own work with my colleagues, we found that, we have some findings that support this, but we're also raising some questions about this. Our research revealed that, in particular, Spanish English adult bilinguals produce not just more disfluencies, they actually produce distinct disfluency patterns, and these patterns align with common features and patterns of speech in Spanish. So when we just say, oh, more disfluencies, it's more complex than that. We actually see more mazes, which are fragments of an utterance, and more syllable repetitions than English monolingual speakers. And these are patterns that are actually more common in Spanish than they are in English. So we're really kind of wanting to pick apart this, are these patterns, as they've been previously attributed to, intrinsic feature of bilingual language management, or maybe could these be influence of Spanish as a first language, as the L1, on English as a second language? So this is sort of a really interesting area, but it's also meaningful because it indicates a potential for misdiagnosis of speech and language disorder among Spanish English bilingual children, in particular misdiagnosis for stuttering. And the research that does exist indicates that especially bilingual Spanish English bilingual children are paradoxically over and under diagnosed with, in particular, stuttering and other speech and language disorders. And the majority of the work that's been done among bilinguals has been on very small samples or clinical populations. So once again, we have normative milestones that have been largely just based off monolingual samples, which means we lack generalizability and there's really limited predictive value for bilinguals. We don't have the picture fully for young learners, and particularly for young learners who are emerging bilinguals. So even just characterizing these profiles would represent a contribution to the field and one that has sizable clinical implications. So we want to get started on this as well. So my wonderful doctoral student, Esther Garcia Plaza, got started on this task. And for our preliminary analysis, we examined 6 participants in the pilot study, and we have 33 analyzable transcripts from those 6. So the video samples were transcribed and analyzed using CLAN, and then FluCalc on top of that. And we explored the quantity and frequency of speech disfluencies produced by those learners. And we took a look at the single language and mixed language conditions, and we also explored outcomes across the conditions. And so here's just a quick overview of our findings. We wanted to see what types of English disfluency patterns are portrayed by the Spanish-speaking emerging bilinguals, and are there differences in particular in what's called stuttering-like disfluencies? These are the ones that are often attributed to a disorder or stuttering stammering disorder, and also those typical disfluencies. And can we sort of see can we characterize these numbers? And if you look at the green arrows, what's particularly interesting here, these are numbers that are particularly high if you were to compare them to a monolingual baseline norm. So anytime you're moving above 4%, that's sort of on the high end of normal. And if you're getting up to like a 7%, that's sometimes what clinicians use for a threshold. So you can see here that we see higher rates of interjections, more stuttering-like disfluencies, again, on the high side. And for typical disfluencies, again, we're kind of on that high end. So that lets us know there's really something worth exploring here, because we don't necessarily think that any of these learners, all these learners don't have an IEP. We don't consider any of these learners to be clinical cases. And yet we're still seeing what we consider typical speakers produce something that is on the high end if you were to look at it aligned with monolingual norms. So the next step for us is to code and run FluCalc for, again, that whole sample. Eventually, we would love to characterize this large data set. We would love to explore, are there differences in the total types of disfluencies across conditions? Are there differences over time? Are there associations with executive function? What can we learn by looking at language growth data? Do we even see differences over the course of 6 weeks of intensive English instruction? What can we look at with growth data with the other characteristics? One of the challenges for us, of course, with this project is that coding disfluencies requires highly trained coders, and it's extremely intensive for time. So that's sort of our constraints there. And the last coding system that I'll talk about is the SABRE coding system. So we designed this intervention to follow those What Works Clearinghouse best practices, but we also wanted to evaluate the extent to which the curriculum had affordances to support inferential language development. We wanted to sort of evaluate secondarily, are there the necessary elements here that give way for a rich language interaction? And so we used SABRE, which is a coding system that was developed by the researchers from the institutions up there on the screen, and then funding from IES. And so we then looked at the scripted and unscripted conversations, but we specifically focused on those episodes of unscripted conversation. In the whole curriculum, there's slightly over 2,840 of them that are initiated by a scripted question. And so we coded those episodes with that particular focus on capturing upward, so increased linguistic and cognitive demand scaffolding strategies, and downward, right, reduced linguistic and cognitive demand strategies. And we want to look at the inferential language that the curriculum itself requires through the script. But then in addition to that, we want to understand, okay, that's the minimum that the script requires. Then we want to look at what is the inferential language that's being produced by the instructors, who we hope are taking the script and going further, right, with these unscripted portions. And then also, what's the use of inferential language by the students? So we wanted to use the SABRE codes to look at that, and then also try to, capture these qualities of classroom instructional discourse and look at how it might relate to growth in children's skills. So we did adapt the SABRE codes for our own purpose, and it's important to point out that we violated several assumptions with the coding system. Specifically, we used it for an informational text, and it was developed for narrative text. And it was also developed for face-to-face instruction, and we're using it in remote instruction. And it was developed for elementary, but including early childhood, and we're using it with fourth graders. So a few ways that we're sort of applying it to a new context that are worth noting. So here's a quick overview of SABRE. We only used a subset of the codes, the form codes, because of what we were particularly interested in. So this is sort of that subset of codes we were interested in, and we were particularly interested in the inferential language codes. And these are the coding system. These are the codes we used to code those utterances from the script the instructor, and the child. And what we were particularly interested in is looking at how the curriculum stacked up with requirements for inferential language. How would the SABRE codes show that, right? So here's some examples of our curriculum and how it aligns with the SABRE codes. And you can sort of see, we have these questions that are falling into these various types of questions, right? WH questions, how questions. Let's talk about what we wanted to find out. And we wanted to also particularly look, and I'll circle back to this, at real questions versus test questions. So we were happy when we coded the curriculum to find that just like we wanted, the questions in the scripted curriculum, as we intended, required multiple word responses rather than single word responses from the child. That was, our goal. We wanted to raise the expectations for language production on the part of the child. We were also happy to see that all the question forms were represented in the curriculum except yes/no questions, because we intentionally did not design the curriculum to have any yes/no questions. So is what we wanted to see. And in particular, these real versus test questions. And we really wanted to make sure that we had at least a 2-to-1 of test to real. Real questions are questions where the teacher doesn't already know the answer, right? So an example of a real question would be, what is a problem in your community that you would like to decrease? Use that one for the word decrease. And the student responded, oh, I want to fix the park because it's breaking apart. Great, beautiful, right? A test question is an example where the teacher already knows a correct possible answer and is trying to get that sort of as a test for the child. So this is what we were particularly interested in, as well as, we want to see that we do have these real questions in the curriculum. And just as an overview, here's the most frequent inferential language codes for those key 6 instructional moves that we were talking about, right? So what are we actually asking for the children? And if the teachers follow just the curriculum, we really felt looking at this, okay, the data tell us that even if they follow just the script, we would still have created conditions for inferential language production and opportunities for rich language interaction. So our next step, right, we know what the curriculum should have by looking at the script. Now we want to see what's actually happening when the curriculum is delivered. So we wanted to then look at an analysis of the participants' academic language that they're producing using those SABRE long form codes. So we took 2 lessons each from 8 different participants. We focused on those 6 sections of the curriculum that encourage those back and forth discussions with the child and the instructor. So we had 96 different episodes. And then we carefully coded those transcripts to look at the inferential language used and to analyze what's actually going on here, right, when we give the instructors the script and they launch forward. So of those utterances, you can see for the most part, it was the instructors asking the most questions, right? They're there in light blue. But when we look at the comment turns, we are pleased to see we see a fairly equal amount of comment turns between the instructor and the child. And when we look at the questions raised in the curriculum, again, we see the instructors continuously go beyond, right? Go beyond the what is built into the script. And they were trained to do this with the scaffolding training. But you can see, the dark blue is just what the script tells them to do. And the light blue is what the instructors themselves do, right? As they're moving forward with the Strive for 5, with the scaffolding, they're going beyond and asking more questions. And same with those real versus test questions. It follows the same trend as previously, where the instructors are not limited by the scripted curriculum. They're in fact going beyond that. And what was really nice to see is they're going beyond and asking a lot more real questions as well. For the total coded utterances, you can see the comparison here between the instructor and the child. So for both instructor and child, about half of their utterances did contain inferential language, had some inferential language codes. And on average, you can see that the sort of sum of it across each transcript, we have what the curriculum requires, what the instructor produced, and what the child produced. So we're seeing a lot of inferential language. And when you look for a more granular breakdown, you can see here, the dark blue is what the script requires, the light blue is what the instructors did, and then the green is what the child did. And what we sort of saw across the scripts is that the instructors are using the script, then they exceed it. And interestingly, and again, this is sort of our initial trend, but the students tend to follow where the instructor leads with inferential language. So if the instructor really goes beyond the script with a certain type of inferential language, we also see that the child is sort of picking up what the instructor is putting down and doing more in that area too. So quick summary of these preliminary results. We feel that we do indeed have some evidence that rich language production environments are growing from this scripted remote delivery instruction. We don't feel that we see evidence that the scripted curricula is limiting the instructors. The opposite, we feel the instructors are going beyond the script, which is what we hoped they would do. And this is sort of just our preliminary, but it feels like this looks like the students are following the instructor's use of inferential language. And so we want to continue exploring that as well. So here are a few resources if you want to dig more into those kind of specifics for where we're going with those projects. And finally, just in our last few minutes, I'll share our newest direction that we are just beginning, which is using natural language processing to explore the phenomenon of linguistic synchrony. And this is with our great research team here at UF with Dr. Ginny Shin and her grad student, Pauline. So linguistic synchrony refers to the degree to which two speakers synchronize or line up the linguistic properties of their speech when they're in conversation as they reach a mutual understanding. So this can be lexical choices, it can be prosody, it can be syntax, and it sort of represents this convergence, right? That their language is kind of converging as they reach a shared understanding. And research among adults in particular instructional settings, but also in experimental settings, greater linguistic synchrony is associated with more learning gains, but additionally better collaboration and better task performance. So this is a really interesting phenomenon, but it is much less explored among children and among multilinguals. And this may be in part due to the limited availability of appropriate data sets, and in particular, large enough data sets, right? You need a lot of language to look at this. And so this is our sort of ongoing newest project. Our goal is to use NLP to explore this phenomenon of linguistic synchrony in this context where it has not yet been explored, which is one-on-one vocabulary instruction among fourth grade Spanish-speaking English learners who are emerging bilinguals. So again, that LY categorization. Because this is quite new, our first task is actually to examine 3 different methods for extracting linguistic synchrony from these transcripts and compare each method in terms of specific dimensions of linguistic synchrony and see, what do these indices represent and what's the efficiency and accuracy in modeling. But once we've sort of figured out which method we want to use, our goal really is to characterize linguistic synchrony between the learner and instructor during academic vocabulary instruction, and particularly focus on semantic and syntactic similarities that occur when the child adapts to the instructor's input. And if it occurs, and I'm sort of curious, and I wonder if it does, maybe if the instructor also adapts to the child. So we kind of want to see, does this occur? What does it look like? We have 28 dimensions of linguistic synchrony to explore. So we also want to know kind of, where does linguistic synchrony live, right? Where does the majority of this synchrony happen? If it does happen, and what features do synchronize? So then, assuming that we do find some dimensions that synchronize, we then want to look at, okay, what are the associations with linguistic synchrony and short-term and long-term assessments, right? So are there dimensions of linguistic synchrony that are associated with that weekly test that they take, right? That short-term assessment? Are there features of linguistic synchrony that are associated with that final assessment, right? That sort of vocabulary gains at the end of the study? And we're also particularly interested in these temporal elements. So when does linguistic synchrony occur? Are there, for example, times in the lesson that we see more linguistic synchrony? Could it relate to inferential language? Could it be more chit-chat, right? Maybe there's more linguistic synchrony in the chit-chat portions. Is it with test questions or real questions? And from this, hopefully by answering this, we can draw some really interesting pedagogical insights and implications for the design of instructional environments that promote linguistic interaction, that promote linguistic synchrony, assuming we indeed find that linguistic synchrony is associated with learning gains, as has been found in monolingual contexts and instructional contexts. So the overarching goal of this will be to shed light on how the language of children changes as a result of that adult modeling and input, and ideally provide some insight into language modeling as a source of input for learners' language growth. So that's what we hope to do with that, but we've just been getting started with this, so here are the details, and I hope that we will have very exciting preliminary findings to share with you at AAAL this spring. So that's all from me. I think I'm running up against my time, and so I really appreciate your attention, and I want to give a shout out to the wonderful and large group of researchers, including many of our grad students who are working on these various projects at USF, at UF, at GSU. And I welcome your feedback. I certainly welcome any suggestions. If you can think of other cool ways that you would like to explore these data, we would love to hear about it. And I have a few references if you need them, but I'm gonna put it back quickly on our team so you can see our wonderful team of researchers, and I'll stop there.